She was 25 years old, and the world had made her an orphan twice over, first by taking her father, and then by taking his name. Emma Mercer stood on the dusty fringe of Fort Laramie, with nothing to her name but a set of mule harness he had prized, and $2 silver in her pocket. With that money, she bought a freight wagon so rotted and broken that no one else at the auction would even bid. But what nobody knew, what the wind and the high plains had kept secret for 3 long years, was that hidden beneath its warped floorboards was a truth that would change not only her life, but the memory of the man who had given it to her. Settle in and stay close as we tell this story of how a $2 wreck became a woman's vindication. Let us know where you're watching from tonight. Emma's life had been measured in the turning of wagon wheels and the steady, plodding gait of mules. Her father, John Mercer, was a freighter, a man whose reputation was as solid as the hickory axles he ran. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, but of quiet competence, and he had raised his daughter in his own image. While other girls learned needlepoint and the proper way to set a table, Emma learned the language of the trail. She learned the difference in the scent of rain on dust versus rain on pine, how to read the clouds for hail, and how to spot the subtle dip in the land that meant water might be found. Her mentor was her father, a man with hands calloused from leather reins and hot iron, but whose touch was always gentle when he showed her how to splice a rope or set a splint on a mule's leg. He taught her that a well-maintained wagon was a living thing, a partnership of wood and iron that you had to know intimately. "Listen to it, Em," he would say, his hand resting on a side panel. "It'll tell you what it needs. A loose bolt will chatter, a dry hub will groan. You just have to listen." Her world was the vast open country of the Wyoming Territory, the creak of leather, the jingle of trace chains, and the low, reassuring murmur of her father's voice against the endless wind. The beloved object of her childhood was not a doll, but a piece of his work. A small, perfectly tooled leather pouch he'd made for her to carry the fossils and strange rocks she found along the trail. He had died with it in his pocket, and it had not been returned to her. All she had left was his primary mule harness, the one he used for his lead mule, Belle. The brass buckles were heavy in her hands, the leather still holding the faint scent of his sweat and the oil he used to keep it supple. It was the last tangible piece of his skill, of his life's work. Their undoing had come not with a dramatic crash or a sudden illness, but with a piece of paper, an army contract to haul a payroll shipment from Cheyenne to Fort Fetterman, with a stop at Fort Laramie. It was the most lucrative contract John had ever secured, a testament to his years of reliability. He had checked every board, every spoke, every inch of canvas on his 2 Murphy wagons. Emma, then 22, had helped him, her eye as keen as his. The shipment was loaded under the watchful eye of a young, ambitious officer, Captain Thorne, and escorted by a small cavalry detail. But the wagons never reached Fort Fetterman. They were found weeks later, miles off the established trail near a place called Grayback Creek, splintered and empty. The mules were gone, the guards were dead, and the Army's payroll had vanished into the thin, cold air. John Mercer, who had been riding with the convoy, was the only survivor, found wandering and incoherent miles away. He could not explain what happened. He remembered a sudden storm, a confusing detour ordered by Thorne, a chaotic attack in the dark. But with the gold gone and the soldiers dead, the official inquiry found him negligent. His reputation, built over 30 years of honest work, crumbled into dust. No one would hire him. The shame settled on him like a shroud, and within 3 years, it had taken him as surely as a bullet. He died quietly in a rented room, leaving Emma with his debts, his tarnished name, and the heavy brass and leather of a harness with no mule to wear it. The day after she buried her father in a plain pine box, Emma walked to the Mercer Freight and Haulage office, the business he had built from nothing. The sign was already painted over with a new name, Croft Overland. Inside, Silas Croft, a man who had once been her father's rival, sat behind her father's desk. He was a man with a soft body and hard eyes, and he did not stand when she entered. He looked at her with a kind of predatory pity that was worse than open contempt. He had bought out her father's assets to cover the last of the debts, he explained. The ledgers were all settled. There was a finality in his voice, a closing of a door she had once called home. "Your father was a good man once," Croft said. The words a small, cruel twist of the knife. A shame how it ended. He pushed a single piece of paper across the desk, a final accounting showing a balance of 0. She did not look at it. She did not argue or plead. Her father had taught her that dignity was something you carried inside, something no ledger could account for. Her eyes scanned the room, stripped of all the familiar things, the maps, the calendars, the worn chair where she used to sit. The only thing left that felt like him was the harness, coiled neatly on a peg by the door. It was his personal property, not a company asset. "That's mine," she said, her voice low and even. Croft gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Take it. It's no use to me." Emma lifted the harness from the peg. The weight of it was both a burden and a comfort. She looped it over her shoulder, the brass buckles cool against her worn dress, and walked out of the office without a backward glance. She was ejected not with a shout, but with the quiet, administrative scratch of a pen, cast out into the indifferent dust of a town that had already forgotten her father's worth. She walked away from the freight yard, the heavy harness a counterweight to the hollowness in her chest. The sounds of Fort Laramie, once the familiar backdrop to her life, now seemed alien and hostile. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of teamsters maneuvering their long wagons, the sharp commands of a drill sergeant on the parade ground. It was a world she was no longer a part of. She was an outsider, the daughter of a man branded a failure. The weight on her shoulder was more than leather and brass. It was the entire physical memory of her father's labor. She could feel the worn spots where his hands had gripped it, the slight curve in the leather that had molded to the flank of his favorite mule. It was an anchor in the swirling uncertainty of her future. She made her way to the edge of the settlement where public auctions were held. It was a dusty, wind-scoured patch of ground where the army and local merchants disposed of surplus, damaged, or confiscated goods. A small crowd of men had gathered, scouts, out-of-work freighters, ranchers looking for a bargain. They were hard-bitten men who sized up every item with a practiced, cynical eye. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a stained vest, was working his way through a pile of army blankets, worn-out saddles, and barrels of salted fish. Emma stood at the back, a solitary figure in her plain dress, the harness coiled at her feet. She listened, her mind calculating, assessing. She had $2. It was not enough for a saddle, not enough for a decent tool. It was barely enough for a meal, but she had a different kind of hunger. She was looking for something to salvage, something to turn into a new beginning, however small. Finally, the auctioneer gestured to the last item, a wreck of a freight wagon that sat apart from the rest, listing sadly to one side like a beached whale. "All right, gentlemen, what am I bid for this piece of Wyoming history?" He called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Came in on a government seizure. Needs a little work." That was an understatement. The wagon was a ruin. One of its massive rear wheels had collapsed, the spokes splintered. The canvas top was shredded and green with moss. The oak sideboards were split and warped, bleached gray by years of sun and snow. The tongue was snapped clean off. The crowd was silent. A few men chuckled. No one made a move. This was not a bargain. It was a pile of firewood that you had to haul away yourself. "Do I hear $5? $3? $1 to take it off our hands?" The auctioneer pleaded. From the edge of the crowd, a man in buckskins watched Emma. He was lean and quiet, his face weathered by the sun. It was Peter Hollis, a scout for the fort. He knew wagons, and he knew this one's story. Emma took a breath. She saw past the rot. She saw seasoned hardwood that could be cut down for furniture or tool handles. She saw iron fittings that could be sold for scrap. She saw a chance. $2, she said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden quiet. The auctioneer's head snapped in her direction, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Emma, then at the wreck, then back at Emma. He shrugged. Sold. For $2 to the young lady with more optimism than sense. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. The men around her looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement. As she stepped forward to hand over her 2 silver coins, Peter Hollis moved to her side. His voice was low, not unkind. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes on the broken wagon. "You should know. That wagon is from the Grayback Creek convoy, the one that vanished 3 years ago." His words hung in the air, a quiet warning. It was not just a wreck, it was a relic of the very disaster that had destroyed her father. Emma paid the clerk her $2, the last of her money, and received a hastily scribbled bill of sale. She was now the owner of a ghost. The crowd dispersed, leaving her alone with the derelict wagon under the vast, indifferent sky. She walked toward it, her steps slow and deliberate, the bill of sale clutched in her hand. Peter Hollis's warning echoed in her mind, but it did not deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. This was a piece of her father's last journey. It was hers now. She began her inspection not with sentiment, but with the practical eye he had taught her. She circled the wagon, her hands running over the rough, weathered wood. The oak of the frame was still sound in places, protected by the overhang of the wagon bed. The sideboards were sun-bleached and splintered, but the wood was dense, old-growth timber, valuable in this tree-scarce land. She ran her fingers over the iron tires, pitted with rust but thick and heavy. The scrap value alone might be worth more than she'd paid. She ducked under the chassis, her eyes tracing the lines of the axles and the reach pole that connected them. The front axle was intact, but the rear one was cracked near the hub of the collapsed wheel. A difficult, but not impossible, repair for someone who knew how. Her father had taught her the art of shrinking a new tire onto a wheel, the magic of fire and water and brute force. The thought brought a sharp pang of grief, but she pushed it down. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Her focus now was survival. She climbed into the wagon bed, her boots crunching on debris and dried leaves. The canvas top offered little protection, its tatters flapping in the wind like prayer flags. The floorboards were the worst of it. They were warped into gentle waves from seasons of snowmelt and sun, some of them soft and punky with rot. Her plan was to pry them up, salvage what she could, and use the solid frame and running gear as the basis for a small, functional cart she could pull herself, a way to haul goods or firewood and earn a few cents. She had her father's harness. Maybe she could even acquire a cheap donkey or an old mule. She began with the loosest boards at the back, using a small pry bar she carried in a leather roll with a few other essential tools. The nails screeched in protest as she worked them free. The wood was damp and smelled of earth and decay. It was slow, laborious work. As she moved forward, board by board, she noticed something odd. Near the front of the wagon bed, just behind where the driver's seat would have been, one board lay perfectly flat. It was not warped like its neighbors. Its color was a fraction darker, less bleached. She knelt, her fingers tracing its edges. And then she saw it, the faint, almost invisible marks of a chisel near the nail heads. These were not the original, hand-forged nails used by the wagon maker. These were newer, cruder. Someone had lifted this board and put it back. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was not rot. This was not damage. This was deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She paused, her hand resting on the flat, unassuming plank. The wind picked up, whistling through the tattered canvas, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Listen to it, Em. It'll tell you what it needs." This wagon was telling her something. It was telling a story that had been silenced for 3 years. With renewed purpose, she set the tip of her pry bar into the thin seam at the edge of the board. She put her weight into it, leveraging the tool with a careful, steady pressure. The wood groaned, but it held fast. The nails were set deep. She repositioned the bar, working the other side, her knuckles scraping against the rough floor. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the dust. Finally, with a sharp, splintering crack, one end of the board lifted a few inches. A different smell rose from the opening, not the damp funk of decay, but the dry, dusty scent of a long enclosed space, with a faint, metallic tang. She worked her fingers under the edge and pulled. The board came free with a final shriek of tortured nails. Beneath it was not the solid timber of the wagon's underframing, but a shallow, neatly constructed compartment, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was a space hollowed out between the main floor and a false bottom. And it was not empty. The first thing she saw was a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied securely with twine. It was surprisingly heavy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it out. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked with age, but it had done its job. She carefully untied the brittle twine and unfolded the wrapping. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents, their edges slightly yellowed, but the ink still dark and clear. They were Army dispatches, but tucked inside the fold of the top dispatch was a single, folded sheet of personal stationery. Beneath the packet, nestled in the dark recess, was a rusted iron strongbox, the kind used for valuables and payrolls. It was small but heavy, its surface pitted and stained. It was locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This had to be it. She set the strongbox aside and turned her attention to the letter. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of an educated man. It was dated just a few days after her father's convoy had disappeared. It read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Corporal Elias Vance. I was an escort for the Fetterman payroll. I am writing this in what I know are my final hours. We were not attacked by road agents. The ambush was a lie, orchestrated by our commander, Captain Thorne, and a civilian contractor named Silas Croft. They planned to steal the payroll and blame the freighter, John Mercer, a man whose only crime was his trust. The attack was staged by men hired by Croft. I was shot not by an outlaw, but by my own captain when I refused to go along with the murder of the other guards. I have been left for dead, but I managed to crawl back to this wagon. I have hidden the proof here. The strongbox contains the true payroll ledger signed by Thorne before we left, and a second, forged ledger created to frame Mercer. The key to the box is taped to the back of this letter. The dispatches prove Thorne ordered the convoy off the main trail against regulations. Take this to the commander at Fort Laramie. Do not trust anyone else. John Mercer is an innocent man. Do not let them bury his name with my body. God grant you the courage to see justice done." Emma's hands were shaking as she finished reading. A cold, clarifying anger washed over her, so pure and sharp it burned away her grief. Silas Croft. Captain Thorne. It all made sense. The new sign on her father's office, the captain's quick rise in reputation, her father's confused and broken testimony. She turned the letter over. Taped to the back with a strip of discolored cloth tape was a small, ornate brass key. She sat on the floor of the broken wagon, the corporal's letter in her lap, the rusted strongbox at her side. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, and a chill was beginning to settle in the air. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of her father's perceived failure. Now, she held the weight of his vindication. The truth was heavier than she could have imagined. Her anger was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but it gave her strength. She took the small brass key from the back of the letter. It felt warm in her palm. With a steady hand, she inserted it into the lock of the strongbox. The mechanism was stiff with rust and disuse. She had to wiggle the key, applying gentle but firm pressure, until, With a grating click, the lock turned. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved. On top lay 2 leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first one. The top of the page read, Official Payroll Ledger, Fort Fetterman Garrison, August 1874. Below were columns of names and figures, and at the bottom, the clear, authoritative signature of Captain Marcus Thorne. She opened the second ledger. It was a cruder copy, the handwriting slightly different. The figures altered. It was designed to show a smaller amount, a version of the truth that could be plausibly lost. Beneath the ledgers lay the payload itself, or what was left of it, a few stacks of bundled banknotes and a small handful of gold coins. It was a fraction of the total, likely what Corporal Vance had managed to secret away before hiding the box. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than Emma had seen in her life. As dusk deepened, a figure approached, walking with the quiet, ground-covering stride of a man at home in the wilderness. It was Peter Hollis. He had circled back, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a flicker of concern for the young woman who had bought the cursed wagon. He carried a canteen and a small bundle. "Figured you might be thirsty," he said, his voice as quiet as his footsteps. He held out the canteen. Emma took it and drank, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. His eyes took in the scene without judgment, the open floorboard, the oilcloth, the open strongbox, the letter in her hand. He did not ask what she had found. He simply waited. His quiet presence was an invitation, a space she could fill with the truth if she chose. She did not show him Corporal Vance's letter that was too personal, too raw. Instead, she handed him the 2 ledgers. "My father didn't lose that shipment," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "It was stolen. By Captain Thorne and Silas Croft." Peter took the ledgers. He was a scout, a man who lived by observation, who understood trails and signs and the deceptions men practiced. He compared the 2 books, his thumb running over the different signatures, his keen eyes noting the discrepancies. He looked from the ledgers to Emma, and in his gaze she saw not pity, but belief. He nodded slowly. "I never figured John Mercer for a fool or a thief," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. He looked at the broken wagon, his eyes reassessing it. It was no longer a pile of scrap. It was a crime scene. It was evidence. "We need to move it," he said, his voice decisive. "But not like this. We need to make it whole again. We can't have them saying we tampered with it." In that moment, he was no longer a stranger. He was her first and only ally. The work began the next morning at dawn. Peter arrived not with questions, but with tools, a heavy jack, a set of wood chisels, a draw knife with a well-worn handle, and a length of seasoned hickory he'd procured from the fort's quartermaster, claiming it was for a new axe handle. "This will do for the axle," he said, laying the piece of wood on the ground. "It's been drying for 2 years, strong as iron." Emma, in turn, had laid out her father's tools, the few she'd managed to keep. A spoke shave, a mallet, a small hand saw. Together, they began the slow, methodical process of resurrecting the wagon. Their communication was sparse, a language of gestures and shared understanding. He would point to a split tenon. She would know exactly how to clean it and prepare it for a new peg. She would indicate the angle needed for a cut. He would make it with clean, efficient strokes. They were 2 people fluent in the grammar of wood and iron. First, they jacked up the rear of the wagon, lifting the immense weight off the shattered wheel. They carefully removed the broken axle, its wood dark and soft with rot, where the crack had let in moisture. Using the old axle as a template, they began to shape the new one from the length of hickory. Peter did the rough work with a small axe, hewing the wood to the approximate shape, while Emma followed with the draw knife and spoke shave, her movements precise and economical, shaving off fine curls of wood until the new axle was a perfect replica of the old one's sound half. Her father had taught her that the strength of an axle was in its grain, and she followed it unerringly. While she finished the shaping, Peter turned his attention to the broken wheel. He dismantled it piece by piece, laying out the spokes and felloes, the curved sections of the rim, like the bones of some great animal. Several spokes were shattered beyond repair, and 2 of the felloes were split. "There's a wheelwright in town," Peter said. "Schmidt, he's an old German, keeps to himself, but he has a stock of seasoned oak." They spent the afternoon in the dusty, cavernous workshop of Jakob Schmidt, a man with a face like a weathered map of the Rhine. He watched Emma run her hand over a stack of oak blanks, testing their weight and grain. He saw the way she held a spoke, sighting down its length for imperfections. He grunted, a sound of gruff approval. "You know the wood," he said. He did not ask about the wagon or her father. He simply saw her competence. He named a fair price for the wood, and when Emma counted out the small amount of coin from Corporal Vance's strongbox, he pushed one of the coins back into her palm. "For luck," he said. Back at the wagon, they fitted the new spokes and felloes into the wheel, their mallets striking a steady rhythm. The final, most difficult task was resetting the iron tire. It had to be heated in a fire until it expanded, slipped over the wooden wheel, and then doused with water so that it would shrink and bind the entire structure together with immense force. Peter built a circular fire, and they laid the heavy iron hoop in the coals. As the iron began to glow a dull cherry red, a woman approached, carrying a covered pot. It was Mrs. Albright, the wife of another freighter who had known John Mercer for years. She had seen them working from her small house nearby. "You two have been at it since sun-up," she said, her voice warm. "You need to eat." She set down the pot, which smelled of rich beef stew, along with 2 spoons and a loaf of fresh bread. "My John always said your father was the best teamster on the plains," she added quietly, before turning and walking away. Emma and Peter ate in silence as the sun began to set, the heat from the fire warming their faces. The simple, unspoken acts of generosity from the old blacksmith and the freighter's wife were like mortar, sealing the cracks in Emma's solitary world. The community was beginning to remember John Mercer not for how his life ended, but for how he had lived it. With the iron tire glowing in the twilight, they used long tongs to lift it from the fire. The heat was immense, a physical force that pushed them back. Working quickly, they positioned the red-hot hoop over the newly rebuilt wheel and, with heavy mallets, hammered it down into place. The smell of scorching oak filled the air. "Now!" Peter yelled, and they began dousing it with buckets of water. The hissing was explosive, a great cloud of steam erupting into the cooling air. As the iron contracted, it groaned and creaked, pulling the entire wheel into an incredibly tight, solid unit. It was whole again. They let it cool completely before greasing the new axle and fitting the repaired wheel. It spun true, silent and strong. The wagon still looked like a wreck, the canvas was still in tatters, the sideboards still bleached and scarred, but it stood level on 4 sound wheels. It was no longer a ruin, it was mobile. It was evidence that could be moved. The next morning, Peter arrived with 2 of the fort's draft horses. He hitched them to the wagon's tongue, which they had temporarily splinted. Emma climbed onto the driver's seat, the place where her father had spent so much of his life. She gathered the reins in her hands, the familiar feel of the leather a steadying presence. With a quiet command from Peter and a click of the reins from Emma, the wagon lurched forward. It rolled. The wheels turned smoothly, the new axle holding firm. They towed it slowly and deliberately away from the auction grounds and toward the fort's main gate, a slow, public procession. Men stopped their work to watch. Soldiers on the stockade walls paused their patrols. The wagon, a ghost for 3 years, was moving again, pulled from its grave. Its journey through the center of the fort was a silent accusation. Peter and Emma brought it to a stop directly in front of the post commander's headquarters. Colonel Davies was a career officer, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his intolerance for corruption. He came out onto the porch, his face a mask of stern inquiry, drawn by the commotion. "What is the meaning of this, Hollis?" he demanded. Peter stood at attention. "Colonel, this is Emma Mercer, daughter of John Mercer. And this is his wagon from the Grayback Creek convoy." Emma stepped down from the driver's seat. She held the oilcloth packet in her hands. With a composure that belied the tremor in her soul, she walked up the steps to the commander. "Colonel Davies," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I have evidence regarding the loss of the Fetterman payroll 3 years ago. Evidence that my father was innocent." She laid it all out for him, right there on the porch. She gave him Corporal Vance's letter, the 2 ledgers, and the official dispatches proving Thorne had ordered the unauthorized detour. She told the story plainly, without embellishment, her words falling into the stunned silence. Colonel Davies read the letter from Corporal Vance, his face growing harder with every line. He examined the ledgers, his trained eye immediately catching the forgery. He looked at the official dispatch, then at Emma, then at the wagon. He saw the truth. He turned to his aide. "Place Captain Thorne under immediate arrest. Send a detachment to bring in the civilian, Silas Croft. I want them both in the stockade within the hour." The order was like a thunderclap. Within minutes, the fort was alive with purposeful movement. The news spread like wildfire, through the barracks, across the parade ground, and into the town. Emma Mercer hadn't just cleared her father's name, she had unearthed a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the fort itself. The dilapidated wagon, which she had bought for $2, now stood as a monument to her unyielding fight for the truth, forcing a town and an army to confront the lie they had been content to live with. In the months that followed, the world shifted back into alignment. A formal military inquiry, presented with the irrefutable evidence from the wagon, convicted Captain Thorne of theft, murder, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was stripped of his rank and sentenced to life at the military prison at Leavenworth. Silas Croft, tried in a civilian court, was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. His assets, including the freight office he had stolen from her father's legacy, were seized. As a matter of justice and restitution, Colonel Davies awarded the Army's standing freight contract for the Laramie-Fetterman line to Emma Mercer. It was her father's old route. People in the town and at the fort began to look at her differently. They no longer saw the daughter of a disgraced man. They saw a woman of immense fortitude, a woman who had single-handedly righted a terrible wrong. Teamsters who had once avoided her gaze now tipped their hats. Merchants who had refused her father credit now sought her business. She had earned her place not through inheritance, but through labor and courage. She ran her freight line with the same quiet competence her father had, her name becoming as synonymous with reliability as his had once been. She hired a few good men, bought a string of strong mules, and her wagons became a familiar, welcome sight on the high plains. She did not sell the Grayback Creek wagon. She moved it to the small plot of land she bought on the edge of town, the land where she built her own small office and corrals. She replaced the rotted floorboards, patched the side panels, and stretched a new, tight canvas over its hoops. It was not for hauling freight. It became her sanctuary, a quiet place to do her paperwork, a shelter from the prairie wind. One cool evening, as the last light of the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Emma stood inside the restored wagon. The air smelled of new canvas and old wood, a scent of endings and beginnings. From a wooden peg on the wall, she took down her father's mule harness. She ran her hand over the supple leather and polished the heavy brass buckles until they shone like gold in the lantern light. She hung it carefully on a hook inside the wagon. Then, she opened a small wooden chest where she kept her most precious possessions. From it, she took Corporal Elias Vance's letter and the small, tarnished brass key to the strongbox. She placed the key on a small shelf she had built just below the harness. The two objects, the harness from the man who had taught her everything, and the key from the man whose final act had saved his name, rested together. They were talismans from two strangers to each other, bound together by an act of injustice, and, finally, an act of truth. Peter Hollis walked up to the open back of the wagon, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. He didn't speak of the past, of the trial, or of the dramatic changes in her life. He just handed her a cup. "Saw your lead wagon pull in," he said. "Looked like a heavy run." "It was," she said, taking the cup. "But the roads are good." They stood there together in the quiet twilight, a comfortable silence between them built on shared work and unspoken trust. Emma looked out from the shelter of the wagon, across the vast, darkening landscape that had once seemed so hostile and was now her home. Emma Mercer was 25 and had been left with nothing but a dead man's shame. She paid $2 for a rotted freight wagon that everyone else saw as worthless. It was the best $2 she ever spent. She was 18 and homeless, adrift in the dusty settlement of Red Rock, with nothing to her name but a worn leather satchel and the $27 her aunt had pressed into her hand as a final, sterile transaction. Her only inheritance was a deed to a worthless piece of land outside of town, a place her estranged grandmother had owned, a place distinguished only by the cracked and leaning ruin of a stone chimney. But what nobody knew, least of all Annie Carter herself, was that hidden deep within the soot-stained stones of that chimney was a secret that would not only give her a home, but a life. Settle in and stay close for this one. And in the comments, let us know what forgotten place holds a special meaning for you. Annie Carter learned the world through the grain of stone and the heft of a hammer. Her grandfather, Thomas Carter, was a stonemason, a man whose hands were maps of calluses and fine white lines of lime mortar, and he had been the whole of her world since her parents had been taken by river fever when she was 5. He had not been a man of many words, but he spoke a language of patience and precision. He taught her how to read a rock, to see its heartline, and the way it would cleave under the sharp tap of a chisel. He taught her that every stone had a face meant for the weather, and a bed meant for the mortar, and that a well-built wall was a conversation between the earth and a man's hands. They lived in a small, sturdy house he had built himself, on the outskirts of a more established town, a house with a foundation of granite fieldstone he and Annie had gathered from the creek bed together. He'd point with his thumb. "See that one, Annie girl? That's a keeper. Flat bed, good face. It'll sit right." And she would learn to see it too. Her most prized possession, carried in the deepest pocket of her satchel, was a small, smooth piece of river slate he had given her on her 10th birthday. It was dark gray and fit perfectly in her palm, and on its surface was the delicate, fossilized imprint of a trilobite, a creature turned to stone millions of years before. "Everything has a story," he'd told her, his voice a low rumble. "Even the stones. You just have to be patient enough to listen." He was her teacher, her father, and her only friend, a steady presence, as solid as the walls he built. But his lungs, long filled with the fine dust of his trade, finally gave out the winter. She turned 18, and with his passing, the foundation of her own life crumbled into dust. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and cold as a winter morning. Her father's brother, Uncle Robert, and his wife, Aunt Maeve, had never approved of Thomas raising her. They saw him as a simple laborer, a man of dirt and stone, while they lived in town and valued clean hands and social standing. They arrived 2 days after the funeral, their faces set in masks of solemn duty. There was no argument, no shouting, just the rustle of papers on the kitchen table. Uncle Robert, a man who worked in a bank and smelled of starch and stale air, explained the situation with methodical cruelty. The house and the land it sat on were to be sold to cover Thomas's debts, which were, he assured her, considerable. Her inheritance, after all was settled, was twofold. First were the $27 in cash. Second was a brittle, folded deed to a piece of land far off in the Red Rock territory, a parcel that had belonged to her grandmother, Ilara, a woman she'd never met. Ilara had been disowned by the family for marrying Thomas, a common mason. The deed was, Aunt Maeve said with a thin, pitying smile, more of a sentimental curiosity than an asset. The land was worthless, she explained. Good for nothing but sagebrush and lizards. Annie didn't speak. There was nothing to say. She stood in the home her grandfather had built, the air still thick with the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, and the wood smoke from the hearth he'd laid stone by stone, and felt herself being erased. The next morning, a small, neatly packed suitcase was waiting for her on the porch. It contained her few changes of clothes. She left it there. She went to her room, took her own worn leather satchel, placed the trilobite stone inside, and tucked her grandfather's small, perfectly balanced mason's hammer into the loop on the side. Then she walked away from the house, down the dirt lane, and did not look back. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, and she had only $27 and a worthless piece of land to her name. She had work to do. The journey to Red Rock was a lesson in dust and distance. For 2 days, she walked the rutted track that passed for a road, the sun beating down on her head and the leather strap of her satchel cutting into her shoulder. The world she had known, a place of green river valleys and familiar faces, gave way to a starker landscape of red earth, twisted juniper trees, and vast, indifferent skies. On the 3rd day, a freight wagon driver named Elias Finch, a man with a kind face and a beard full of trail dust, took pity on her and offered her a ride on his buckboard. He shared his water and a piece of dry bread, asking few questions, and for that Annie was grateful. He spoke of Red Rock as a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go, a hardscrabble settlement built on hope and failure in equal measure. It's a tough place, he said, his eyes on the horizon, but it's honest. It don't pretend to be anything it ain't. When they finally crested the last rise, Annie saw it below, a handful of raw lumber buildings scattered along a dry creek bed, huddled beneath a towering mesa of red rock that glowed like a hot coal in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of pine, dust, and the sharp tang of a blacksmith's forge. It was not welcoming, but as Elias had said, it was honest. She thanked him for the ride, slid down from the wagon, and walked into the settlement, her boots kicking up small puffs of red dust. She felt the eyes of the few people on the street follow her. A stranger, a young woman, alone. She ignored them, her gaze fixed ahead. Her first stop was the Territorial Land Office, a small, hot room that smelled of paper and ink. The clerk, a balding man with sweat stains under his arms, barely looked up as he stamped her deed and pointed on a map to a small square marked with the name E. Carter. It was a mile north of town, he said, on the high bench overlooking the creek. She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a canteen of fresh water from the general store, the transaction leaving her with just over $22. Then she followed the clerk's directions, walking out of the small cluster of buildings and up a winding path onto the high bench. The land was exactly as her aunt had described it. A windswept acre of packed red earth, dotted with stubborn clumps of sagebrush and a few scraggly pines. It was worthless, but then she saw it. Standing alone near the center of the plot, silhouetted against the vast blue sky, was the chimney. It was perhaps 12 feet tall, a solitary column of stone where a house had once stood or had been meant to stand. A jagged crack ran up its western face, and the mortar was crumbling in places, but it was still standing, defiant against the wind and the years. Annie walked toward it slowly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was made of river rock and fieldstone, gray and brown and rust-colored stones of all shapes and sizes, fitted together with a skill that was both art and engineering. She ran her hand over the rough, sun-warmed surface. She recognized the work. She saw the way a long, flat stone was used as a tie, locking the smaller stones around it into a stable whole. She saw the subtle batter, the slight inward slope of the walls that gave it strength. She saw the careful placement of a small, oddly shaped white quartz rock right next to the hearth opening, a decorative touch, a signature. It was her grandfather's work. There was no doubt. He had been here. He had built this. This worthless piece of land held the last thing he had ever built, And suddenly, it was the most valuable thing in the world. That night, she rolled out her blanket at the base of the chimney, the stone at her back, still holding the day's warmth. And for the first time since he had died, she did not feel entirely alone. The next morning, Annie woke with a clear and simple purpose. She would not sell the land. She would not leave. She would repair the chimney. It was a piece of him, and she would not let it fall. She spent the morning clearing the debris from around its base, pulling up weeds and carting away the few rotted pieces of timber that lay half buried in the dirt. The foundation, she was relieved to find, was solid, set deep into the earth. The crack was serious, but not fatal. A mason who knew what they were doing could fix it. As she worked, she began to imagine a small house built against it, a one-room cabin with the great stone hearth as its heart. It was a foolish, impossible dream, but it kept her hands moving. She began to clean out the hearth itself, scooping out decades of old ash, leaves and dirt that had blown inside. It was choked with debris. As she dug deeper, her fingers brushed against something hard and square. It was a loose stone at the back of the firebox, a dark, soot-stained piece of granite that was not set with mortar like the others. Her grandfather had taught her to listen to the stones. She took out his small hammer and tapped it gently. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the dull thud of stone against stone, but a hollow, resonant echo. Her breath caught in her throat. Using the claw of the hammer, she worked it carefully into the seam around the stone, prying gently. The stone shifted. With a final effort, it came loose, scraping against its neighbors. Behind it was a dark, square cavity. Reaching a trembling hand inside, her fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. She pulled it out. It was a heavy tin box, rusted at the corners but still solid, held shut with a simple latch. She carried it out into the sunlight and sat on the ground, her heart pounding against her ribs. With fumbling fingers, she opened the latch. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled in dry oilcloth, were stacks of gold coins, neatly wrapped in paper rolls, and on top of them, a thick, folded envelope with the name Annie written on it in a careful, elegant hand. She opened the letter first, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfold the paper. The handwriting was her grandmother's, but the words were from them both. My dearest Annie, if you are reading this, it means the world has been harder on you than we ever hoped, and we are no longer there to help. For that, I am so sorry. Your grandfather Thomas built this hearth and chimney the year before you were born. We bought this small piece of land with what little we had, a secret place, a hope for a future your family would never have allowed us. Thomas wanted to build a whole house for us here, a new start, away from the judgment and the cold shoulders. But his lungs grew bad, and we never got the chance. He built the chimney first. He always said a house begins with the hearth. It is the heart, he said, that keeps the cold out. He built this hiding place into it. He said a good mason always leaves a secret. Inside this box is every dollar I was able to save, over 20 years of mending and washing for the fine ladies in town. It is not a fortune, but I hope it is enough for a start. Enough for lumber, perhaps. Enough for a roof over your head that is truly your own. Your grandfather loved you more than words can say. He saw his own strength and patience in you. He used to watch you playing with stones in the yard, and he would smile. She has the eye for it, Elara, he'd say. She sees how things fit together. We hoped you would never need this, that your aunt and uncle would do right by you. But we knew their hearts. They are small, frightened people. Do not let their bitterness poison you. This land is not worthless. It is a beginning. The chimney is strong. Your grandfather built it to last. Let it be the heart of your home. Know that you were loved, Annie. You were loved fiercely. With all our hearts, Elara and Thomas Carter. Annie read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. It was not the money that broke her open, but the words. You were loved fiercely. She clutched the paper to her chest, the sound of her own quiet sobs lost in the vast, empty landscape. She was not an orphan left with nothing. She was the heir to a love story, a secret plan, a final gift left in a heart of stone. The gold coins were not just money, they were years of her grandmother's quiet labor. The chimney was not a ruin, it was a foundation. After a long time, she carefully folded the letter and put it back in the box. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and looked at the chimney, her chimney, and knew exactly what she had to do. She was going to build her house. The next day, Annie walked back into Red Rock, no longer an outcast, but a woman with a purpose, and the means to achieve it. Her first stop was the lumber mill at the edge of town, a sprawling, noisy place that smelled richly of sawdust and pine sap. The owner, Silas Blackwood, was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with hands as gnarled as oak roots. He watched her approach with skeptical eyes, leaning against a towering stack of freshly cut planks. Annie did not waste time. She laid out her hand-drawn plan on a stump, a simple square for a one-room cabin, the dimensions carefully measured to fit against the chimney's base. She explained what she needed: foundation posts, floor joists, wall framing, siding, and roof beams. Silas listened without interruption, his gaze shifting from the drawing to her face and back again. He pointed a thick finger at her drawing of the roofline. "You've got the pitch steep," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Good, sheds the snow. Where'd you learn to draw a plan?" "My grandfather taught me," Annie said simply. "He was a stonemason," Silas grunted, a sound of grudging respect. He quoted her a price, fair but not cheap. Annie opened her satchel and paid him in gold coin, counting the pieces into his wide palm. His eyebrows shot up, but he asked no questions. It was not the way of Red Rock. He promised to deliver the lumber to her plot the following morning. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "That chimney of yours, the old Carter chimney, it's got a bad crack." "I know," Annie said. "I'm fixing it." He just nodded, a new light in his eyes. Her next stop was the general store, run by a widow named Martha Gable. Martha was a kind, bustling woman who saw the hardness in Annie's eyes and the resolve beneath it. Annie bought nails, a good crosscut saw, a level, and a sack of lime to mix her own mortar. It was a large purchase, and Martha helped her bundle it. "Building something out there?" she asked, her voice gentle. "A home," Annie replied. Martha smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "You let me know if you need anything else," she said. "Your credit is good here." The offer was a quiet gift, a thread of trust offered to a stranger, and Annie felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The rebuilding was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. The lumber arrived as promised, and Annie set to work with a singular focus. The first task was the chimney. She spent 2 days carefully chipping out the old, crumbling mortar along the crack, cleaning the stones until they were bare. Then, mixing the lime, sand, and water in a wooden trough, she made a fresh batch of mortar, the familiar, earthy smell filling the air and reminding her of her grandfather. She worked from the bottom up, forcing the new mortar deep into the crack with a trowel, setting small, carefully chosen stones into the larger gaps, keying the two sides of the crack together until they were one solid mass again. It was his work, and now it was hers, their hands joined across time by the same craft. When the chimney was stable, she began the house. She dug the post holes, set the foundation posts, and with immense effort, leveled the floor joists. A man named Jedediah Stone, an old prospector with a shock of white hair, who lived in a small shack down by the creek, wandered up one afternoon to watch her work. He watched for an hour as she struggled to notch a large beam with her saw. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice and said, "You're fighting the wood, girl." He disappeared and returned with a heavy, sharp tool called a broadaxe. Without another word, he showed her how to stand on the log and hew the face flat, how to let the weight of the axe do the work, the big, clean chips of wood flying with each swing. He stayed for 2 hours, teaching her the rhythm of it, and then left as quietly as he had come. Annie never forgot the lesson. She raised the walls one by one, a skeleton of timber that slowly grew into the shape of a room. Martha Gable would sometimes walk up from town with a jar of cool water or a fresh loaf of bread, her presence a quiet blessing. Silas Blackwood delivered a second load of lumber, planks for the roof, and stayed long enough to help her raise the main ridge beam, his brute strength making a task that would have taken her days into an hour's work. They did not speak of friendship or community, but it was being built all the same, nail by nail, beam by beam, right alongside the house. The day the roof was finished, a sense of profound peace settled over Annie. She had done it. She had built a home. It was small, just one room, but the walls were square, the floor was solid, and the roof was tight. The great stone chimney stood as its anchor, a monument of love and endurance. That evening, she built the first fire in the newly repaired hearth. She stacked the kindling and logs, just as her grandfather had taught her. And when she set a match to it, the flames caught and roared to life, the smoke drawing perfectly up the flue and rising in a thin, straight line into the twilight sky. The fire filled the small cabin with a flickering, golden light and a deep, comforting warmth. It was the heart of her home, now beating strong. Over the next few months, Annie's life took on a new rhythm. She became a part of Red Rock, not just a stranger passing through. People no longer saw her as the homeless girl, but as Annie Carter, the one who built her own place. Her skill with stone became known, and soon she was being asked to repair a crumbling well lining for the blacksmith, or to lay a new stone foundation for an addition to Martha's store. She worked for pay, for barter, for the simple satisfaction of the work itself. She traded a new hearth for the storekeeper, for a winter's worth of flour and salt pork. She repaired Silas Blackwood's front steps, and he gave her a milk cow, a gentle Jersey, with soft brown eyes. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. Her life woven into the fabric of this small, tough community. They were people who respected work, and Annie Carter worked as hard as any man among them. Her small cabin became a true home, filled with the smell of baking bread, drying herbs, and the constant, steady warmth of the fire. The unwanted inheritance, the symbol of her family's rejection, had been transformed from a burden into a refuge, a source of dignity and quiet strength. A year to the day after she arrived in Red Rock, a deep snow fell, blanketing the high bench in a thick layer of silent white. Inside her cabin, Annie sat in a simple wooden chair she had made herself, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The room was warm and safe, a fortress against the cold and the wind that howled outside. The light of the fire glinted off the smooth surface of the trilobite fossil, which sat on one end of the rough-hewn mantelpiece. On the other end sat a small, heart-shaped river stone she had found while digging the foundation, a stone she imagined her grandmother might have noticed and smiled at. Between them, the fire burned. She thought of her aunt and uncle, not with the sharp pain of anger anymore, but with a distant, quiet understanding. They had given her what they thought was nothing, a final dismissal, an acre of dust and a pile of broken rocks. They had meant to cast her out, to leave her with no foundation at all, but they had unknowingly sent her to the only true inheritance she had ever had. They had sent her back to her grandfather, to his last work, and through him, to the grandmother she had never known. They had sent her to a place where her own two hands were worth more than a family name. Annie Carter was 19 now. She had arrived in Red Rock with $27 and a broken heart. She had spent it all on a future she couldn't see, on a pile of stones that everyone else saw as a ruin. It was the best investment she had ever made. The chimney stood, solid and true, its smoke a steady prayer against the cold winter sky, the heart of a home built by a love that even death could not destroy. This story is a testament to the idea that what we inherit is not always what is written on paper, but what is built with love and hard work. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might find strength in it. And now we ask you, what is the most valuable thing you've ever built with your own two hands? It doesn't have to be a house. It could be a garden, a friendship, or a new beginning. Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. Thank you for being here with us today.